They said it was impossible. They said no enslaved man could outsmart a powerful white family, let alone destroy it from the inside. But in the summer of 1853, on a quiet plantation hidden behind Georgia pines, one man executed a plan so bold, so reckless, that by morning 6 sisters would be bound by the same secret, and an entire household would begin to collapse from within. This is not a story about romance. It's a story about control, desperation, and the dangerous illusion of choice, inside a system built on lies. Before the story moves any further, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss these hidden chapters of history, and stay with us, because what begins quietly in this house will end in devastation no one could control. Elijah was not born dangerous, and that fact mattered, because danger in a place like the Hawthorne Plantation was usually loud, visible, and quickly punished, while Elijah learned early that the safest threats were the ones no one noticed. He was born into slavery, hemmed to perform satisfaction even in private, and this isolation was the fault line Elijah recognized long before he ever considered action, because isolation bred vulnerability, and vulnerability, in a house ruled by certainty, created pressure. Elijah's own vulnerability was never absent from his awareness. Every movement he made was still governed by ownership, every breath conditioned by risk, but he understood that his perceived harmlessness gave him room to maneuver psychologically, even as he remained physically constrained. And this understanding did not make him reckless, it made him patient, because patience was the one resource slavery could not fully strip away. He did not dream of rebellion in the dramatic sense, did not imagine himself overthrowing the system that bound him, because he understood too well the cost of visible resistance, but he did recognize the quiet hypocrisies that sustained that system, the way morality was enforced selectively, the way control depended on silence as much as violence, and over time he began to see the Hawthorne household not as an unassailable fortress, but as a structure riddled with contradictions, each one carefully concealed beneath routine. The sisters, for all their privilege, lived under surveillance nearly as constant as his own, their lives mapped out by a father who spoke of protection but practiced possession, and Elijah recognized in their confinement a distorted mirror of his own, not equal, never equal, but parallel enough to create misunderstanding. And misunderstanding, he knew, was dangerous terrain. He never mistook their frustrations for solidarity, never confused their restlessness with shared struggle, but he did understand that people constrained by rigid roles often reached for agency wherever it appeared, and agency, when denied legitimate expression, could become reckless. The plan that would later destroy the Hawthorne family did not arrive fully formed, did not announce itself as destiny or revenge, but emerged gradually from observation, from the accumulation of small truths that no one else bothered to connect, from Elijah's growing awareness that the household's moral authority rested not on virtue, but on performance, and that performance depended on everyone believing the same story about themselves and each other. Elijah's greatest insight, the one that would shape everything that followed, was not about desire but about secrecy, that the sisters' greatest fear was not sin but exposure, not wrongdoing but being seen as having chosen something outside the script written for them, and he understood that choice, even the illusion of it, carried weight in a world where so little was freely chosen. This understanding did not make him cruel, but it did make him dangerous, because danger does not always announce itself with anger or force. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in listening, patience, and timing, and by the time Elijah began to consider what might happen if the household's carefully maintained silences were disrupted, the conditions for collapse were already in place, waiting not for passion but for opportunity, waiting for a night when control would relax just enough for illusion to masquerade as freedom. And when that night finally came, it would not feel like destruction in the moment, but like release, until morning revealed what had truly been set in motion. As Elijah's awareness of the Hawthorne household deepened, what began as careful observation gradually evolved into a quiet education, one that shaped not only his understanding of the 6 sisters, but his understanding of power itself, because power, he learned, was rarely maintained by force alone, but by narrative, by who was allowed to speak, who was believed, and who was rendered silent. And the Hawthorne daughters, despite their status, lived inside a narrative that denied them authorship over their own lives, a truth Elijah recognized not with sympathy, but with precision, because empathy could blur judgment, while precision clarified opportunity. He noticed how each sister occupied a distinct emotional role within the family, roles assigned not by choice, but by expectation. The eldest burdened with responsibility and quiet resignation, trained to model obedience as virtue, the second sharp-tongued and restless, masking dissatisfaction with wit that was tolerated only because it remained contained, the middle sisters suspended between compliance and rebellion, uncertain where to place their frustration, and the youngest still clinging to the hope that patience would eventually be rewarded. And Elijah understood that these roles isolated them from one another even as they shared the same roof, because comparison replaced connection and performance replaced honesty. His education was not limited to their personalities but extended to the rhythms that governed their days, the hours when supervision loosened, the moments when authority retreated into fatigue or ritual, the subtle signals that indicated when rules were being enforced and when they were merely being remembered. And he catalogued these details with the same care he applied to his assigned duties, because attention was his currency, and he spent it sparingly. Elijah's interactions with the sisters remained brief and unremarkable on the surface, defined by politeness and restraint. But beneath that restraint he cultivated consistency, becoming someone whose presence did not demand explanation or vigilance, someone whose listening felt safe precisely because it appeared inconsequential. And this safety allowed the sisters to lower their guard without realizing they were doing so, to speak thoughts aloud they had never fully articulated even to themselves. And Elijah did nothing to encourage or redirect these confessions, understanding that influence was most effective when it appeared absent. He learned, for instance, that the sisters' education had given them language without agency, teaching them how to articulate virtue but not how to pursue fulfillment. And this imbalance created a tension that surfaced in unexpected ways. Sarcastic remarks, sudden tears, moments of impulsive defiance quickly smothered by guilt, and Elijah listened to these expressions not as invitations, but as evidence that the household's moral order depended on repression more than conviction. He also learned that the sisters trusted the system far less than they claimed, that their outward piety masked private doubts about the righteousness of a world that demanded their obedience while offering no clear reward beyond eventual marriage. And Elijah recognized the danger in this doubt, because doubt, once uncontained, could destabilize identities built on certainty. Yet he also recognized that doubt alone did not create action, that what transformed doubt into movement was the belief that one was acting alone, that one's transgression was singular rather than shared, and this belief, he realized, was the linchpin of the household's stability, because as long as each sister believed her dissatisfaction was unique, she would guard it fiercely, protecting the illusion of order even as she suffered beneath it. Elijah's education then became an exercise in understanding how isolation functioned as control, how secrecy preserved hierarchy by preventing collective awareness, and how the appearance of virtue depended on the careful management of silence. And this understanding did not inspire him to immediate action, because he knew that premature movement would invite detection, and detection meant annihilation. Instead, he refined his patience, allowing time to do its work, allowing the sisters' frustrations to mature, allowing the household's contradictions to accumulate without intervention, because systems often collapsed not from attack, but from the weight of their own unresolved tensions. Elijah also studied himself during this period, interrogating his own motive, with a rigor born of necessity, because self-deception was a luxury he could not afford, and he asked himself repeatedly whether his interest lay in revenge, in control, in validation, or in survival, and each time he arrived at the same answer, that his primary objective was agency, the ability to shape at least one outcome in a life otherwise dictated by others, and this objective did not require innocence, but it did require clarity. He did not romanticize the sisters' dissatisfaction, nor did he confuse it with shared struggle. understanding that their confinement, however real, existed within a framework that still protected them, and that any plan involving them would place him at far greater risk than it placed them, and this asymmetry weighed heavily on his calculations, because risk in his world was never evenly distributed. Yet he also understood that asymmetry was precisely what made the situation volatile, because the sisters' sense of safety, however constrained, allowed them to entertain impulses he could not, and those impulses, when acted upon, would trigger consequences they were ill-equipped to manage. Consequences that would ripple outward, affecting everyone involved. Elijah's education extended to the household's unspoken taboos, the lines that could not be crossed without shattering reputations, and he learned that these taboos were enforced less by punishment than by fear of exposure, because exposure threatened not only individuals but the narrative that sustained the family's social standing, and this fear created a brittle order, one that appeared strong but could fracture under the right pressure. As months passed, Elijah's role within the house remained unchanged, his demeanor steady, his obedience unquestioned, and this consistency reinforced the family's perception of him as harmless, a fixture rather than an actor, and this perception was crucial because it allowed him to operate beneath the threshold of suspicion, gathering insight without provoking scrutiny. The sisters, for their part, began to rely on his presence as a neutral space, a place where words could be spoken without immediate consequence. And this reliance deepened their sense of isolation from one another, because it offered relief without resolution, allowing them to vent frustration without confronting its source. And Elijah understood that this dynamic, left unchecked, would eventually demand release, because tension that is acknowledged but not addressed rarely dissipates, it accumulates. Education he was receiving was therefore not merely about the sisters, but about the household as an organism, one that relied on compartmentalization to function, separating roles, emotions, and truths into discrete chambers that rarely intersected. And Elijah recognized that his unique position, visible enough to be trusted, invisible enough to be ignored, placed him at the intersection of these chambers, granting him a perspective no one else possessed. He did not yet know the exact shape his actions would take, but he understood the conditions required for disruption, and he understood that when those conditions aligned, the result would not be a clean break but a cascade, because secrets, once shared unevenly, did not remain contained. They multiplied. Elijah's quiet education, then, was not a prelude to seduction but to exposure, not an indulgence in desire, but an exploration of how fragile authority became when its narratives were quietly contradicted. And as he moved through the house performing his duties with unremarkable precision, he carried within him a growing certainty that the Hawthorne household, for all its rules and rituals, rested on a foundation of denial, and that denial, once illuminated even briefly, could unravel everything, not through force, but through the simple act of allowing people to believe they were choosing for themselves. And it was this belief, fragile and intoxicating, that would soon transform observation into action, turning education into execution, and setting the stage for a night that would reveal how quickly order could collapse when silence was mistaken for stability. As the conditions Elijah had been studying finally converged, the household entered a period of uneasy calm that felt to him less like peace and more like the held breath before collapse, because the rhythms he had memorized began to misalign in subtle but meaningful ways. Elijah experienced parallel awakenings without realizing they were not alone, and this parallelism intensified their emotions, because isolation magnifies feeling, convincing the individual that their response is extreme rather than typical, and Elijah understood that extremity often drives action. The night that would later be spoken of in fragments did not announce itself with drama but arrived quietly, shaped by circumstance rather than intention, as a storm unsettled the grounds and drew the household inward, compressing space and heightening awareness, and Elijah's duties extended later than usual, keeping him within proximity of the sisters at a time when fatigue had lowered defenses and the absence of authority felt pronounced. It was in this compressed environment that the carefully maintained separations between the sisters began to erode, not through confrontation but through coincidence. As small interactions overlapped and echoed, revealing similarities in thought and feeling that had previously been hidden by rivalry and routine. And Elijah, positioned at the intersection of these overlaps, became the unwitting catalyst for a realization none of them were prepared to face, that their dissatisfactions were not unique, that their doubts mirrored one another, and that the rules governing their lives were sustained not by inevitability, but by collective compliance. This realization did not manifest as a unified rebellion, but as a series of individual decisions made in rapid succession, each sister acting under the belief that her choice was singular, that her transgression, if it could be called that, was contained within the privacy of her own conscience, and Elijah did nothing to correct this belief. Understanding that revelation, when shared unevenly, multiplies impact rather than diminishing it, he moved through the house that night with deliberate normalcy, responding to requests, offering assistance where asked, his demeanor unchanged, and this constancy reassured the sisters even as it masked the gravity of what was unfolding, because normalcy, when preserved in extraordinary circumstances, creates the illusion that consequences are distant or manageable. The interactions that occurred were defined less by physicality than by confession, by moments where words crossed thresholds they had previously skirted, where boundaries were tested through proximity rather than action. And Elijah's role in these moments was not to lead but to remain present, allowing each sister to project meaning onto his silence. And it was this projection that bound them to their choices, because meaning, once self-generated, feels more authentic and therefore more difficult to renounce. The household structure, designed to prevent precisely this kind of overlap, failed not because of negligence, but because it underestimated the power of accumulated restraint, the way prolonged suppression can transform minor allowances into perceived freedoms. And Elijah recognized that the destruction unfolding was not the result of a single plan executed flawlessly, but of a system encountering its own contradictions simultaneously across multiple points. By morning, the house would appear unchanged to the untrained eye, its routines intact, its hierarchies unchallenged in appearance. But beneath that appearance lay a network of altered perceptions, because each sister now carried knowledge that recontextualized her place within the family, and Elijah carried the burden of understanding that his presence had served as the axis around which these perceptions shifted. He did not celebrate this shift, because celebration implies victory, and victory was never his objective, nor did he retreat from it, because retreat would suggest regret, and regret was a luxury he could not afford. Instead, he absorbed the weight of what had occurred with the same restraint he applied to every aspect of his existence, aware that the true consequences had yet to manifest. Because systems rarely collapse immediately after disruption, they strain, they adapt, and then they fracture, often in ways no one anticipates. Elijah's awareness of this delayed impact sharpened his focus, because the night's events, though contained in time, had irreversibly altered the household's internal dynamics, and those alterations would soon demand reckoning, not only from the sisters, but from the structure that had shaped them. And as dawn broke over the Hawthorne estate, casting familiar light over an unfamiliar reality, Elijah understood that what had been set in motion could not be undone, that the plan, if it could be called that, had succeeded not by granting him power, but by exposing how fragile power had always been, and that the true destruction would come not from revelation alone, but from the desperate attempts to restore a narrative that no longer aligned with the lived experiences of those forced to uphold it. In the days that followed, the Hawthorne household moved forward as though guided by muscle memory rather than intention, each person performing their role with an exaggerated precision that betrayed an unspoken awareness that something fundamental had shifted, because when systems are disrupted without visible rupture, those within them often respond by clinging more tightly to form, hoping repetition will restore meaning, and Elijah watched this response unfold with a clarity that came not from detachment but from proximity, because he was woven into the routines that now felt strained, his presence both familiar and newly charged, a reminder of continuity in a space where continuity had been quietly compromised. The sisters, each carrying her own version of the previous night's implications, avoided one another in ways that felt deliberate yet uncoordinated, their paths crossing less frequently, their conversations clipped and formal, as though language itself had become a liability, and Elijah recognized this avoidance as a defense mechanism, a way to preserve individual interpretations by preventing collective acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would force comparison, and comparison would dismantle the illusion that each experience stood alone. The eldest retreated deeper into duty, increasing her oversight of household affairs with a fervor that bordered on obsession, as though order, if enforced rigorously enough, could overwrite memory. And Elijah observed how this rigidity strained her composure, turning responsibility into a burden that isolated her further, because leadership without honesty becomes performance, and performance exhausts even the most disciplined. The second sister's wit sharpened into cruelty, her remarks cutting not only at others but at herself, revealing a growing bitterness that no longer sought laughter but reaction. And Elijah noted how this shift unsettled the household, because sarcasm, when stripped of humor, exposes resentment too openly to be dismissed. The middle sisters, caught between fear and curiosity, oscillated unpredictably, sometimes withdrawing entirely, sometimes seeking proximity without conversation, their behavior marked by a restlessness that betrayed internal conflict. And Elijah understood that their uncertainty stemmed from a sudden awareness of choice. Because once the possibility of deviation is recognized, compliance becomes a decision rather than a default, and decisions invite doubt. The youngest, whose hope had once been her refuge, now appeared subdued, her optimism tempered by a new seriousness, as though she had glimpsed the cost of longing and was weighing whether it was worth bearing. And Elijah saw in her restraint the early formation of self-censorship, the kind that emerges not from external punishment, but from internalized fear. The household's authority figures responded to these shifts with denial, attributing changes to fatigue, to weather, to temperament, anything but the truth that the structure they governed had been destabilized from within. And Elijah recognized this denial as both predictable and perilous, because denial delays response, and delayed responses often escalate rather than resolve conflict. The matriarch, sensing unease she could not name, doubled down on propriety, instituting stricter schedules and reinforcing boundaries with renewed emphasis, her actions driven less by confidence than by anxiety. And Elijah saw how these measures, intended to restore control, instead heightened tension by drawing attention to the very constraints the sisters were struggling to reconcile. The patriarch's eventual return brought no relief, because his authority, long assumed to be absolute, now felt misaligned with the household's internal reality, and his presence introduced a new layer of performance, as each daughter presented a curated version of herself designed to avoid scrutiny. And Elijah understood that this curation, while effective in the short term, further fragmented their sense of identity, because maintaining separate selves for different audiences demands constant vigilance. Within this environment, Elijah maintained his routine with meticulous care, aware that any deviation could attract suspicion, and yet he also recognized that his neutrality was no longer neutral, that his mere existence now carried symbolic weight, representing both the catalyst for disruption and the witness to its aftermath. And this duality placed him in a precarious position, because witnesses are often blamed not for what they do, but for what they see. The sisters' interactions with him became cautious, their words measured, their silences heavy with implication, and Elijah felt the subtle shift from unconscious reliance to conscious restraint, a transition that marked the end of ignorance and the beginning of strategy, because once individuals recognize the stakes of their actions, they begin to calculate rather than confess. This calculation, however, did not bring peace, because strategy without trust breeds isolation, and isolation amplifies fear. And Elijah observed how fear manifested differently in each sister, shaping decisions in ways that reflected their distinct roles and vulnerabilities. Rumors, inevitable in any closed system under strain, began to circulate among the household staff. Fragments of observation stitched together into speculation, and while these rumors lacked specificity, their existence signaled a breakdown in containment, because secrecy depends not on silence alone, but on coherence. and coherence had been compromised by the household's internal dissonance. Elijah navigated this growing scrutiny with care, understanding that ambiguity could be both shield and threat, and he responded to questions with consistency, offering nothing that could be misinterpreted yet nothing that invited further inquiry. And this balance required constant attention, because suspicion thrives in gaps as much as in revelations. The true weight of the previous night's events began to surface not in overt confrontation, but in subtle recalibrations of behavior, in the way doors were closed more firmly, in the way glances lingered a moment too long or avoided contact altogether. And Elijah recognized these recalibrations as signs that the household's moral economy was being renegotiated internally, each individual adjusting boundaries based on revised perceptions of risk and reward. The sisters' shared silence, though unspoken, became a fragile pact, one that protected them collectively by maintaining the illusion of normalcy, and Elijah understood that this pact, while stabilizing in the short term, was inherently unstable, because it relied on mutual restraint without mutual understanding. And restraint, when unacknowledged, often gives way to resentment. As weeks passed, the tension did not dissipate but transformed, settling into a low-grade unease that permeated daily life. And Elijah felt the cumulative effect of this unease, aware that he household was approaching a threshold where containment would no longer be possible, because unresolved contradictions accumulate pressure, and pressure demands release. He did not know the form this release would take, whether exposure, punishment, or collapse. But he understood that the destruction implied in his original calculation was not an event, but a process, one that unfolded incrementally as narratives frayed and authority lost coherence. The plan, if it could be called that, had moved beyond his control, evolving in response to variables he could influence but not dictate, and Elijah grappled with the weight of this realization because agency, once exercised, carries responsibility for outcomes that cannot be neatly anticipated. Yet even as uncertainty loomed, he remained committed to clarity, refusing to retreat into denial. Their restraint was not acceptance but calculation, an attempt to survive a shifting landscape without committing to a position that might later prove dangerous. The youngest, whose transformation had been the quietest, now displayed signs of internal conflict that manifested as compliance bordering on self-erasure. Her obedience so complete it drew concern, and Elijah saw in her behavior the cost of premature disillusionment, because when hope is extinguished too early, it often gives way not to rebellion but to resignation, a state that preserves order at the expense of self. The household's authority figures, sensing unrest they could not define, intensified surveillance under the guise of care, increasing their presence in shared spaces, monitoring conversations more closely. And Elijah understood that this escalation, while intended to restore control, would instead heighten paranoia, because surveillance signals mistrust, and mistrust fractures relationships faster than overt punishment. The staff, too, felt the shift, their movements more cautious, their speech more guarded, as rumors solidified into narratives that, while still speculative, began to shape behavior. And Elijah recognized that once narratives take hold, truth becomes secondary to plausibility, because people act not on what they know, but on what they believe others might believe. The weight of this collective anxiety began to press inward, and Elijah found himself navigating a landscape where every action was subject to interpretation, every neutrality suspect, and he understood that the household had entered a critical phase where containment would depend on identifying a scapegoat. Because systems under stress often seek to externalize blame rather than confront internal contradiction, he prepared himself for this possibility with the same discipline he applied to all threats, reviewing his actions, refining his responses, ensuring that nothing in his conduct could be isolated and amplified into proof of wrongdoing. Yet he also acknowledged the limits of preparation, because scapegoats are chosen not for their guilt but for their convenience, and his position made him both visible and expendable. The sisters' interactions with him grew increasingly formal, their earlier ease replaced by a careful distance that signaled not rejection but fear, and Elijah accepted this shift without protest, understanding that proximity now carried risk not only for him but for them, and that withdrawal, while painful, was a rational response to uncertainty. This withdrawal, however, did not dissolve the underlying tension. It merely redirected it inward, intensifying the sisters' private struggles as they grappled with the implications of what could no longer be denied, yet could not be spoken, and Elijah understood that such internalization often leads to fracture, because individuals cannot indefinitely contain contradictions without some form of release. The release, when it came, did not arrive as confession or confrontation, but as error, a small misstep magnified by suspicion. When a routine task was overlooked, a message misdelivered, a schedule disrupted, and this error, trivial in isolation, became the catalyst for scrutiny. Because it provided a tangible focus for anxiety that had been searching for form, Elijah observed how quickly attention coalesced around this disruption, how questions multiplied, how assumptions hardened, and he recognized the pattern with grim familiarity, because systems under strain often seize upon anomalies as evidence of deeper disorder, using them to justify measures that would otherwise appear excessive. The household's response to this minor incident revealed the extent of its instability, as authority figures reacted with disproportionate severity, instituting inquiries and restrictions that signaled a loss of confidence in informal control, and Elijah understood that such responses, while intended to restore order, often accelerate collapse by exposing the system's insecurity. The sisters, witnessing this escalation, retreated further into themselves, their silence now reinforced by fear of collateral damage, and Elijah saw how their earlier sense of individual exceptionality gave way to a shared awareness of vulnerability. Because the possibility of collective consequence had become real, this awareness, paradoxically, both united and divided them, uniting them in fear while dividing them in strategy, as each weighed self-preservation against loyalty, and Elijah recognized that this calculus would ultimately determine the household's fate, because systems fracture when individuals prioritize survival over cohesion. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere grew increasingly brittle, conversations carefully curated, movements deliberate, and Elijah felt the cumulative toll of constant vigilance, aware that endurance, like suppression, has limits, and that the household was approaching a point where the cost of maintaining appearances would exceed the perceived benefits. He did not know which fracture would come first, confession, accusation, or flight, but he understood that the destruction implied in his original calculation was now inevitable, not because of any single act, but because the system had lost its capacity for trust, and trust, once eroded, cannot be restored by authority alone. The plan, if it could still be called that, had achieved its most dangerous success, not by exposing secrets, but by altering perception, by revealing the contingency of roles and the fragility of narratives that had once seemed immutable. And Elijah stood within this altered landscape with a sober awareness of his own precarity, knowing that survival would require not triumph but restraint, not visibility but patience, because when systems collapse, they often do so unevenly, crushing those caught at the intersections of power and vulnerability. And as the Hawthorne household continued to strain under the weight of its unspoken truths, Elijah prepared himself for the next phase, understanding that what followed would not be contained within walls or reputations alone, but would spill outward, reshaping lives in ways no one, least of all him, could fully control. The Hawthorne household crossed into the next phase of its unraveling. The pressure that had been building invisibly began to express itself through decisions rather than moods, because fear, once it exhausts denial, seeks resolution, and resolution in rigid systems often arrives as judgment, and Elijah sensed this shift before it was announced. Noticing how authority figures stopped asking open-ended questions and began issuing conclusions framed as concern, how observation hardened into interpretation, and interpretation quietly transformed into accusation without ever passing through certainty. The minor incident that had sparked scrutiny did not fade as expected, but expanded in significance, accumulating context through repetition until it became emblematic of disorder itself. a symbol onto which every unspoken anxiety could be projected, and Elijah recognized this symbolic inflation as a warning sign, because when systems begin to treat symbols as threats, they reveal their inability to confront root causes. The patriarch convened private discussions under the guise of prudence, consulting advisors whose loyalty lay not with truth, but with stability. And these consultations produced recommendations designed to restore appearances rather than address fracture, emphasizing discipline, hierarchy, and exemplary punishment as remedies for unease, and Elijah understood that such remedies, while effective at silencing dissent, often deepen resentment. Because they resolve uncertainty by force rather than understanding, the sisters, sensing the change in tone, adjusted their behavior once again, but this time the adjustment was not merely defensive, it was anticipatory, as each began to prepare for outdoor ohms that had not yet been articulated, rehearsing explanations, considering alliances, and calculating which truths could be sacrificed to protect others. And Elijah saw how this preparation marked a turning point. Because once individuals begin to plan for fallout, the possibility of reconciliation diminishes, replaced by strategies of survival. The eldest, burdened by her perceived responsibility for household order, found herself drawn into the mechanisms of judgment, consulted as a source of insight into her sister's conduct, and Elijah observed the strain this placed upon her, because participation in authority required her to betray confidences she could not name without implicating herself, and this impossible position fractured her sense of self, forcing her to choose between the role she had been assigned and the reality she could no longer ignore. The second sister, increasingly alienated, began to withdraw her provocations, not out of compliance but calculation, understanding that visibility now carried risk, and Elijah noted how her earlier defiance transformed into strategic silence, a silence sharpened by resentment, because restraint adopted under threat often hardens rather than softens opposition. The middle sisters, whose neutrality had once been protective, now found themselves vulnerable to misinterpretation, because in an environment seeking culprits, neutrality appears suspicious, and Elijah saw how their careful balance began to fail, drawing unwanted attention that forced them to consider disclosures they had previously avoided. The youngest, whose resignation had shielded her from scrutiny, became the unintended beneficiary of lowered expectations, her compliance interpreted as virtue, and Elijah recognized the cruelty of this misreading, because it rewarded self-erasure while punishing complexity, reinforcing a moral economy that valued appearance over integrity. The household staff, sensing the direction of authority, adjusted their behavior accordingly, aligning themselves with perceived power not out of malice but necessity, because survival within hierarchical systems often depends on anticipating which narratives will be endorsed, and Elijah felt the subtle shift in their interactions with him, the warmth replaced by caution, the neutrality by distance, and he understood that this distancing was a prelude to isolation, because isolation makes accusation easier by reducing resistance. Rumors, once diffuse, began to converge, shaped by official interest into more coherent stories, and Elijah recognized that coherence, even when false, can be more dangerous than chaos, because it provides a framework within which action can be justified, and he watched as conjecture hardened into consensus through repetition rather than evidence. The patriarch's decision to impose stricter oversight on daily operations signaled a loss of faith in informal control, and this oversight manifested as inspections, interrogations, and the formalization of rules that had previously been understood rather than enforced, and Elijah understood that such formalization often reveals the arbitrariness of authority, because rules, once written, invite comparison, and comparison exposes inconsistency. The sisters experienced this oversight as a collective tightening, their movements monitored, their interactions constrained, and Elijah saw how this restriction, intended to prevent deviation, instead heightened awareness of constraint itself, because boundaries, once emphasized, become objects of focus rather than background assumptions. The weight of impending judgment pressed inward, and Elijah found himself rehearsing responses not because he expected to be questioned directly, but because he understood that in systems under strain, explanation is demanded not from those most responsible, but from those most vulnerable, and vulnerability, in his position, was structural rather than behavioral. He prepared by refining his consistency, ensuring that every account he offered aligned seamlessly with established routine, that nothing in his demeanor suggested deviation or intent, and this preparation required constant vigilance, because vigilance itself can appear suspicious if it disrupts natural rhythm. The sisters' shared silence, once a protective pact, now began to fray under pressure, not through betrayal but through the subtle divergence of priorities, as each weighed the cost of disclosure against the risk of collective punishment, and Elijah understood that this divergence was inevitable, because unity sustained by fear rarely endures once consequences become tangible. The first formal inquiry, when it came, was framed as clarification rather than accusation, its language carefully chosen to elicit confession without acknowledging suspicion, and Elijah recognized this tactic as a means of testing resistance, because responses to such inquiries often reveal more through tone than content. The sisters' answers, cautious and rehearsed, satisfied surface requirements but failed to restore confidence, because authority, once unsettled, seeks certainty rather than plausibility, and plausibility, however consistent, cannot substitute for control. The inquiry's inconclusive outcome did not ease tension but intensified it, because unresolved investigations signal weakness, and weakness within authority often prompts escalation, and Elijah sensed that escalation was imminent, not because of new evidence, but because of the need to demonstrate decisiveness. The household's atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with anticipation, and Elijah felt the cumulative strain of existing within a space where every interaction carried potential consequence, aware that endurance was becoming less sustainable with each passing day, and that the next phase would likely demand sacrifice, because systems seeking to reassert control often require visible penalties to restore credibility. He contemplated the possibility that he would be chosen as such a penalty, not because of proof, but because his removal would offer symbolic resolution, allowing the household to externalize disruption and reaffirm hierarchy. And this contemplation forced him to confront the limits of his agency, because while he had influenced conditions, he could not dictate outcomes. The sisters, sensing the narrowing window for inaction, began to experience the cost of their silence more acutely, and Elijah observed how fear began to compete with loyalty, creating fractures that could no longer be smoothed over by restraint alone. And he understood that the coming decisions would redefine not only relationships but identities, because choices made under threat often linger as defining moments. As the household prepared for what it framed as restoration, Elijah stood at the center of converging narratives, aware that the destruction set in motion was approaching its most visible expression, not as chaos, but as order imposed without understanding, and he braced himself for the reckoning to come, knowing that whatever form it took, it would expose the truth the household had long resisted, that control maintained through silence and isolation is inherently fragile, and that once the illusion of unanimity is broken, no amount of authority can fully repair the fractures left behind. The reckoning, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself with confrontation or spectacle, but unfolded through a series of procedural steps that masked severity beneath formality, because the Hawthorne household, like many systems built on hierarchy, preferred the language of order to the language of truth, and Elijah recognized this preference as both shield and weapon, designed to make consequences feel inevitable rather than chosen. The patriarch's decision to act was framed as necessity rather than judgment, justified by appeals to propriety and stability, and this framing allowed those involved to participate without acknowledging the moral weight of their participation, because responsibility, when diffused through process, becomes easier to bear. Elijah was summoned not as an accused but as a subject of review, his conduct examined alongside schedules, duties, and routines, and he understood the significance of this framing, because review implies deviation without naming it, allowing suspicion to exist without evidence, and he responded with the same consistency he had cultivated for months, his answers precise, his demeanor unremarkable, aware that in such settings, the absence of contradiction often provokes escalation rather than resolution. Because authority seeks confirmation of its concerns, the sisters were questioned separately, their testimonies shaped by fear, loyalty, and calculation, and Elijah sensed, even without hearing their words, how the process itself exerted pressure, because separation prevents solidarity, isolating individuals within their own narratives and forcing them to choose between self-protection and coherence. And he understood that this design was intentional, not to uncover truth, but to identify fault lines. The eldest, burdened by her role and proximity to authority, struggled to maintain neutrality, her responses careful but strained, and Elijah saw how the process exploited her sense of responsibility, drawing her into complicity by framing participation as duty, and this exploitation fractured her further, because duty, when weaponized, erodes integrity rather than preserving it. The second sister's strategic silence was interpreted as evasiveness, confirming suspicions rather than dispelling them, and Elijah recognized the irony of this misreading. Because restraint, once valued, had become suspect in a system desperate for affirmation, the middle sister's attempts at balance failed under scrutiny. Their careful ambiguity read as coordination, and Elijah understood that ambiguity, in environments seeking clarity at any cost, is often punished more harshly than open defiance, because it resists categorization. The youngest, whose compliance had shielded her, was spared direct interrogation, her virtue assumed rather than examined, and Elijah saw how this selective scrutiny reinforced the household's moral economy, rewarding conformity while penalizing complexity. As the review progressed, its outcome became increasingly apparent, not because of new information, but because of narrative convergence. As authority figures aligned their interpretations to produce a coherent account that justified decisive action, and Elijah recognized this convergence as the final stage of scapegoating, where ambiguity is resolved not through truth, but through consensus. The decision, when announced, was presented as corrective rather than punitive, framed as a measure to restore order and prevent further disruption. And Elijah was informed that his duties would be reassigned, his presence within the household reduced, ostensibly for the sake of efficiency, and he understood the subtext immediately, because reduction is often the first step toward removal, a way to isolate without confrontation, and he accepted the decision without protest, knowing that resistance would only confirm suspicion. The sisters received the news with composed expressions that masked a spectrum of reactions: relief, guilt, fear, and regret. And Elijah felt the weight of their unspoken responses, aware that his removal offered temporary resolution at the cost of unresolved truth, and that this trade-off would shape their futures in ways they could not yet comprehend. The household, eager to signal restoration, resumed its routines with renewed emphasis. Schedules tightened, roles clarified, and Elijah observed how quickly the machinery of order reasserted itself once a focal point for anxiety had been identified, because systems often mistake the removal of discomfort for the resolution of contradiction. Yet beneath this surface restoration fracked. Eras remained, because narratives imposed under pressure rarely align with lived experience, and Elijah sensed that the sisters' internal landscapes had been irrevocably altered, their awareness of contingency and constraint now impossible to unlearn. His own reassignment placed him at the margins of the household, physically distant yet symbolically present, a reminder of disruption contained but not erased, and he navigated this new position with the same restraint that had defined his survival, aware that marginalization, while safer than visibility, carried its own risks. Because those on the margins are often forgotten until they are needed as examples, the sisters' interactions with one another shifted subtly in his absence, their earlier avoidance replaced by cautious engagement, as though the removal of a shared focal point forced them to confront one another directly. And Elijah understood that this confrontation, however limited, marked a departure from isolation, because shared experience, once acknowledged, alters relational dynamics even when words remain unsaid. Guilt, unevenly distributed, began to surface in quiet gestures, in glances held too long or apologies implied rather than spoken, and Elijah recognized guilt as a double-edged force. capable of fostering empathy or entrenching silence, depending on how it is processed, and he wondered which path the sisters would take, knowing that the system surrounding them offered little space for honest reckoning. The household's authority figures, satisfied with the appearance of resolution, redirected their attention outward, their confidence restored by action, and Elijah saw how this redirection allowed them to avoid examining the conditions that had produced disruption in the first place, because reflection threatens authority by revealing its limits. Time passed, and with it, the immediacy of crisis faded, replaced by a cautious normalcy that felt more brittle than before, because the memory of instability lingered beneath routine, shaping behavior in ways that were subtle yet persistent. And Elijah felt this persistence in the way eyes followed him when they thought he did not notice, in the way conversations paused at his approach, reminders that containment does not equal forgetting. The sisters' lives continued along paths shaped by expectation, but Elijah sensed that their internal narratives had shifted irreversibly, that the awareness awakened could not be fully suppressed, and that this awareness would influence decisions yet to come, perhaps not dramatically but decisively, because small deviations, repeated over time, can alter trajectories more profoundly than single acts of rebellion. Elijah's own understanding of agency evolved in this aftermath, tempered by the recognition that influence does not guarantee control, and that disruption, once initiated, acquires momentum independent of intent. And he grappled with the moral ambiguity of his actions, not seeking absolution but clarity, understanding that survival within oppressive systems often requires choices that blur the line between resistance and complicity. The destruction promised by the plan had manifested not as ruin, but as transformation, subtle and uneven, reshaping relationships, perceptions, and possibilities without announcing itself as catastrophe. And Elijah recognized this outcome as both victory and loss, because while the system's fragility had been exposed, it had not been dismantled, merely adjusted, and adjustment, while less satisfying than collapse, can still carry lasting consequences. As he moved forward in his altered role, Elijah carried with him the knowledge that silence, once broken, cannot be fully restored, and that the awareness seeded within the Hawthorne household would continue to exert pressure long after he was no longer present to witness it. And it was this knowledge, more than any immediate outcome, that defined the reckoning's true impact, because it ensured that the illusion of unquestioned order had been permanently disrupted, leaving behind a legacy of doubt that authority could manage but never entirely erase. In the long aftermath of Elijah's reassignment, when the Hawthorne household settled into a version of normal that felt more curated than lived, the true consequences of what had unfolded revealed themselves, not through scandal or confession, but through quiet, irreversible shifts in identity. Because systems rarely collapse outright when challenged from within, they adapt, absorbing disruption by redistributing its cost among those least able to name it. And Elijah came to understand that the final stage of the plan was not destruction in the dramatic sense, but diffusion, the spreading of awareness so thinly across time and memory that no single moment could be isolated as the cause, yet nothing could return to what it had been before. His marginal position became permanent, a quiet exile within proximity, and in that space he learned the weight of being neither central nor free, because marginalization offers safety only insofar as one remains useful, and usefulness within rigid systems is a conditional state, always subject to re-evaluation, and he carried out his altered duties with the same restraint that had defined his survival, not out of submission but understanding, because endurance required consistency more than protest. The sisters, meanwhile, continued along paths shaped by expectation, marriages discussed, futures negotiated, appearances maintained. Yet beneath these outward continuities, Elijah sensed the persistence of internal divergence, because once individuals recognize the contingency of their roles, they cannot fully unrecognize it, and that recognition, however suppressed, influences choice in subtle ways, shaping tone, timing, and tolerance. The eldest's authority softened into caution, her leadership marked by hesitation where certainty once reigned, and Elijah understood that her participation in judgment had fractured her relationship to duty. transforming obedience into a conscious act rather than an unquestioned identity, a change that would shadow every future decision she made. The second sister's resentment did not dissipate, but refined itself, losing its sharp edges and gaining depth, her silence no longer reactive but deliberate. And Elijah saw how this transformation, while less visible, was more enduring, because resentment that matures into clarity often fuels long-term disengagement rather than immediate rebellion. The middle sisters found themselves drawn closer together, their shared experience of misinterpretation fostering a tentative solidarity, and Elijah recognized this as one of the plan's unintended outcomes, because isolation, once breached, can give rise to connection even under constraint, and connection, however fragile, offers a counter-narrative to imposed hierarchy. The youngest's resignation hardened into resolve, her compliance masking a quiet determination to shape her future within the narrow margins allowed, and Elijah saw in her the cost of early disillusionment, but also its strange empowerment, because lowered expectations can sometimes free individuals to pursue goals that would otherwise feel forbidden. The household's authority figures, satisfied with the appearance of restored order, moved on, their attention captured by new concerns, and Elijah understood that this redirection was both relief and indictment, because it confirmed that the system's primary objective had never been truth but continuity, and continuity, once achieved, rendered introspection unnecessary. Time passed, and with it, memory softened, the edges of the crisis blurring into anecdote, and Elijah felt the strange dissonance of living alongside a past that others referenced obliquely or not at all, because silence, when normalized, becomes indistinguishable from forgetting, yet forgetting is never complete. It lingers in habit and hes. His own understanding of agency matured in this period, stripped of illusion and sharpened by consequence, and he recognized that influence within oppressive systems rarely produces clean victories, but instead yields complex legacies that must be borne rather than celebrated. And this recognition did not diminish the significance of what had occurred, but reframed it, placing emphasis not on outcome but on disruption itself, because disruption, once introduced, alters the parameters of possibility even when it fails to dismantle structure. Elijah eventually left the Hawthorne household, his departure unremarked, folded into the ordinary churn of labor reassignment, and he carried with him no acknowledgement of his role in what had transpired, no validation or condemnation, only the quiet certainty that he had shifted something fundamental, however imperceptible it appeared to those invested in stability. The sisters' lives continued without him, yet the awareness seeded during that period persisted, shaping how they navigated intimacy, authority, and self-conception. And Elijah understood that this persistence was the plan's final expression, because systems depend on internalized narratives to function, and once those narratives are questioned, compliance becomes a choice rather than a given. The destruction, then, was not of reputations or households, but of unquestioned belief. The belief that order was natural, that roles were fixed, that silence equaled virtue, and this destruction, subtle and uneven, resisted documentation, surviving instead in altered trajectories and quiet refusals. Elijah did not frame his actions as triumph or tragedy, because both implied conclusions he did not possess. Instead, he understood them as intervention, a moment where agency, however constrained, asserted itself against inevitability, and this understanding sustained him, because it affirmed that even within systems designed to erase individuality, moments of choice remain possible, though costly. The Hawthorne household, like many before and after it, endured, its walls standing, its routines intact. Yet Elijah knew that endurance did not equal innocence, and that beneath the polished surface lay a history of accommodation and denial that would continue to shape those within it long after his absence. And so the story does not end with revelation or punishment, but with continuity altered, with lives proceeding under the quiet influence of what can no longer be unseen, because once awareness enters a system, it cannot be fully expelled, only managed, and management itself is evidence of change. This is why histories like Elijah's resist neat conclusions, because their impact lies not in spectacle but in residue, in the subtle shifts that accumulate over time, reshaping structures from within until the original form becomes unsustainable, even if the collapse is deferred. And as we close this chapter, remember that the most powerful disruptions are often the least visible, unfolding not in moments of drama, but in the quiet recalibration of belief. And if this story held your attention and made you question what history often leaves unsaid, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next Untold chapter, and leave a comment telling us how deeply this story moved you, because these conversations, like the truths they uncover, matter most when they are shared.